All right, welcome everybody to the Institute on Religion and Democracy. All of you who are here physically, those of you who are watching live online, and those of you who will be watching this posted video in the future. I am Mark Tooley, president of the Institute, and really pleased that we're able to host this conversation about Baptist political theology based on this very important book of that title. It came out last year. The topic is important not just to Baptists, who are the largest Protestant group in America, but important, I should hope, to all who are Christian and more widely to all who are interested in interaction of religion and public policy in America. I like to point out that Baptists have basically become the paramount religious force in American Protestantism, including among those who don't identify as Baptists, but effectively are Baptists. So America is probably more Baptist than it's ever been before, hence the importance of and the need for this book and this conversation. We have three very expert speakers, two of whom contributed to this book. Our first speaker will be Paul Miller, who teaches at Georgetown University. Our second will be Jonathan Leeman, who is with 9 Marks here in the Washington, D.C. area. And our respondent will be Matthew Arbo, who previously taught at Oklahoma Baptist, and is now here in the Washington, D.C. area. So each speaker, Paul and Jonathan, will speak for about 10 minutes at the start, and there'll be time for the two of them to respond to each other, or rather, perhaps Matt should go first, and they can chime in after your first response. Their comments will wrap up about 7 o'clock, and then there'll be time for questions and comments from you all. We'll conclude the program by 7:30, but obviously you all are more than welcome to linger and converse and eat and drink. I want to say as long as you want, but within reason and some limits. So glad you all could be here, and Paul, if you would begin.
So thank you, Mark, and IRD, and to all of you for your time. Appreciate you coming to listen to me read the book. If you'll follow along on page 1. It was a privilege to co-edit this volume with Tommy Kidd and Andrew Walker. I'll share a little bit about where this book came from and what are some of the bigger themes that I think emerged as I read and edited all 32 some chapters of it. This book emerged, it's about 5 years ago now, when Andrew Walker and I were having coffee on the sidelines of the Ethics and Religious Liberty annual summit. And we are the two members of the Baptist fan club of Political Theology and Natural Law. And we just got to talking about how much we think the Baptist tradition has far more to offer these conversations about politics, public philosophy, public policy, than is widely recognized. There's a perception that Catholics and sort of high church Protestants have cornered the market on political theology and social theory, and we just didn't think that was true. And we began talking back and forth about what about Isaac Backus, what about John Leland, what about Roger Williams, and what about our history of involvement in the American Republic and the American experiment, and on and on and on. As we got excited in talking, we kind of started to formulate this idea of all these collected essays on the various subjects. It seemed that there was quite a lot that we could contribute collectively, not just he and I, but all of the many people who contributed to this. Our key contribution as Baptists, when I say we, I'm going to be talking about we Baptists. Our key contribution, I hope you all know, is religious freedom and disestablishment. The idea that the rights of conscience should enable us to worship as we see fit, as we're led, as our consciences lead us to, and that there should not be an alliance, a formal tie between a national church and a government. But that's not the full extent of a Baptist political theology, because that only makes sense if it rests on a whole lot of other things that are going on that allow religious freedom and disestablishment. Religious freedom and disestablishment only makes sense if you have, like, the rule of law. if you have a relatively free system of government, if you have a self-governing polity, if you have things like checks and balances. So it kind of turns out by believing in religious freedom and disestablishment, you're actually presuming a kind of a Republican, small r Republican, form of government. And I'd suggest that that might be what a Baptist social theory is. That if there's one organizing concept for a Baptist political theology, a Baptist social theory, it is republicanism. And I'm going to stress that's small r, republicanism throughout this talk. When I say Republican, I'm not talking about the Republican Party. I think that republicanism is implicitly a lot of what Baptist political theology is, or what we've gravitated around. It's the kind of center of gravity for what our public policies are built upon. What is republicanism? Well, republicanism is this idea that there is a public body, a res publica, that is distinct from individual citizens and also distinct from the leaders, the rulers, the president, the prime minister, the king, that the public body is a distinct thing, and that the good of the public body is the legitimate end of government. That government ought to seek the good, the flourishing of the public body, which is good for the people within it, but the good of the public is distinct from the good of the individuals. And it's also quite distinct from the good of the rulers. Republicanism is not the same thing as democracy, but democracy usually goes with it because voting and representation and majority rule is how we adjudicate what counts as the public interest. That's how we discern what it is. We all vote and we kind of count it up and we decide, okay, this is what we are going to say is the public interest for now. Republicanism is self-government. The public body governs itself. We're not governed by a foreign ruler, but we're also not governed by the whim of one particular sinful ruler. We don't trust one particular ruler, so we want to distribute that power. We are all participants in that act of governing, of self-governing. If the public body is made up of all of us, we all participate in its self-government. And republicanism, above all else, means that we put the public interest first and foremost. We understand that we should not use positions of public interest for private gain. So you have to guard against that corruption, that self-dealing. That is republicanism. Those are the sets of ideas that I think are implied within a lot of what Baptists have argued about politics. You have to have that kind of system for religious freedom and disestablishment to make sense. And our history bears that out. Throughout the Anglo-American history, since the founding of Baptists as a distinctive Christian witness, we have always been on the side of Republicans. From the time of Cromwell and the English Civil War, Baptists sided with the parliamentarians. So much so that there were some Baptists who actually signed the death warrant of King Charles. And when his son was put back on the throne, he then executed some Baptists in turn. So we were that high up in the Republican government. During the American Revolution, Baptists' fidelity to the American cause, the American Republic, was so well known that George Washington later wrote a letter in which he praised Baptists for being, quote, uniformly and almost unanimously the firm friends to civil liberty and the persevering promoters of our glorious revolution. So Baptists were famous for being on the side of Republicans in the English Civil War, in the American Revolution, and clear up through the present day, with a few notable exceptions. That does mean if we organize our political theology around republicanism, today, I suggest, we need to remember that republicanism isn't just a legal set of institutions. It's also a culture. It's a culture that sustains a republic. It's not the same thing as a Christian culture, although godliness is good for this life as well as for the next. I think that Christianity is a helpful pillar of republicanism, but it's not the only one. I think a culture of republicanism involves things like public spiritedness or vigilance against self-dealing. It involves a well-informed debate and a respect for process and a literate citizenry and a willingness to compromise. And these are the cultural elements of republicanism that I'd like to see Baptists and all Christians hold up and value and commend and say to be a Christian involved in the public today means to be public spirited. It means to be well informed. It means to engage in a process and be patient with the process, even if it's inefficient, even if it generates conclusions we don't like. We Christians should support this kind of political culture because it supports a free government in which we can have religious freedom and disestablishment. And I think that would be a good product of a Baptist political witness.
Thank you, Paul.
Yep.
Yeah. Jonathan.
Thanks, brother. It's funny you start there, or that you land on Republic. I didn't know what he was going to say. He didn't know what I was going to say.
Well, I read your chapter.
Well, you did read my chapter, but I didn't use that language of republicanism, I don't think. But that's right where I'm going to go. Let me start here, though. A few days ago, Nate Fisher, who I believe helps fund the American Reformer, tweeted, "I understand nostalgia for the Constitution or longing to restore the principles the founders established. But if you will not accept the reality that this is long gone, if you judge others based on fidelity to a set of, scare quotes, principles that govern no one, then you are a fool." I guess I am a fool, because I still think the American experiment is worth pursuing and holding on to and moving forward with. I trust I don't need to tell the audience in this room there's been a resurgence of various authoritarian perspectives on how to govern the republic, whether they go by the title of general equity theonomist, think Moscow, or Christian nationalist, also there but elsewhere, magisterial Protestant, or some of our friends at Davenant, like Brad Littlejohn, or he was formerly there, Roman Catholic integralism, when we did the Whig thing, Mark, that's what we talked about quite a bit, common good constitutionalism, their basic pitch is the same. The American experiment has failed. What woke identity politics is giving us is a form of authoritarianism, and so you can have their authoritarianism or our authoritarianism. I'm gonna give you a slightly different way of looking at the landscape, whereas I understand some of that critique. Bringing the whiteboard back. What you have, I think, in many respects, are can you guys all see this? These aren't the best labels because we can dispute the labels. Let's call it liberalism. And here I mean kind of a contemporary Rawlsian liberalism, okay? In the middle we have republicanism, small r, as Paul was just talking about. And over here, I don't have a great label. I want to call it authoritarianism. But to play nice, I'll call it a highest good teleology, okay? Right, that's, the state is geared towards yielding the highest good for which we were created, right? And that's going to be everything from a Christian theonomy to communism, right? Some sense of the universe and how it works, and the state is needs to be oriented toward producing citizens that live according to that highest good, whatever that is. If we were to pick like the primary virtue of liberalism, at least in its Rawlsian form, I mean, let's just go with that, right? Liberty, in some sense, negatively probably defined. If we go over here to highest good, it's going to be some sort of virtue, right? So we know why human beings were created, and to live in a just society, they need to live according to that virtue. Republicanism kind of wants both. It wants the liberty and the virtue, right? It's like, I want this from you guys, and I want this from you guys. And we call that, as he just said, self-government, right? And to do meaningful self-government, you need virtue, but it's not constrained by the state as such, it's self-governing. And what this yields is a concept of limited jurisdiction of the state, limited powers, right? And what this yields, or at least aims to yield in the best case scenario, is, let's say, righteous laws. These marriage laws are righteous. These marriage laws are unrighteous. These ways of treating the unborn is righteous. These ways of treating the unborn is unrighteous. Liberalism doesn't want to use that language, doesn't want to talk that way. That feels authoritarian to it. But again, republicanism kind of wants both, right? It wants virtuous or righteous laws. This is an unstable compound. This is like the liquid in the laboratory. They got to keep it just the right temperature, just the right humidity, lest the thing break apart. But that's precisely where a Baptist political theology is trying to go, right? It's calling, as Paul explained so well, it's saying, on the one hand, government has a limited jurisdiction, hence religious freedom. But on the other hand, within that jurisdiction, it's not anything goes. There's a certain teleology, God, to whom we subscribe, and therefore there is such a thing as righteous and unrighteous laws. Now, a lot of our theonomist friends and magisterial Protestant friends keep critiquing this and saying that leads to authoritarianism. Indirectly, maybe it does. Meanwhile, these guys, your philosophical liberals, every time they look in this direction, all they see is authoritarianism. So this feels like authoritarianism to them. And that is the critique of this. This looks like authoritarianism. This can look like moral chaos of our present moment. And again, this is where we're trying to land the plane, but how do you do that? Right? That's the challenge. And if we start mapping out different Christian political theologies, we could place them in different places in this spectrum. I think of a magisterial two kingdoms. It's sort of somewhere over here. Whereas a Westminster David Van Drunen, let's call it Westminster 2K, is closer in here. Sometimes spirituality of the church leans over here, right? Theonomy, magisterial Protestant, it's all over here. This is any kind of religious authoritarianism, or a religious, again, like I said, like communism, fascism, and so forth. That's very much over here. And different Christian traditions as well have tried to lean one way or the other. A good Protestant political theology is right here, a 1788 Westminster Confession, Presbyterian political theology, is also going to be right here with the Baptists. Whereas the original 1646 Westminster Divine authored Westminster Confession is going to push a little bit more in this direction. When John Winthrop comes along, he finds common cause with the Baptists, signs the Declaration of Independence, because the Presbyterians are feeling the oppressions of the Anglicans and Congregationalists, and they're going to say, hey, we're going to stand over here with the Baptists. And so our American Presbyterian tradition and our Baptist theology finds itself very much in here. So this isn't just Baptist, but I'd say the Baptists are the best at it, personally, as a Baptist. Let me give you 6 things, and I don't have time to unpack them, but 6 things on which a Baptist political theology biblically is going to rest. Number 1, it's going to begin actually with your view of baptism and the church, which is to say, you see this separation of church and state necessarily at the beginning, because you understand that the church is made of born-again people. It's not made of all of the citizens of a state, which brings us to the second thing. Insists on separating religious and political authorities as well as national and church identities, okay? Now, within a Presbyterian, or rather a Paedo-Baptist scheme, you don't have to go in this direction, but you're able to go to the direction in which all the babies born into the state can simultaneously be baptized into the church, you see? Which means your national membership, citizenship, and your church membership become largely overlapping. As such, you can have such a thing as Anglican England, Roman Catholic Spain, Christian Europe. Those things are at least possible, not required, but possible in a Paedo-Baptist conceptuality, whereas in a Baptist conceptuality, That's impossible. It just again, because your church membership and your citizenship are just necessarily non-overlapping circles. It's born-again people who you're looking to bring into and baptize into the church. So it insists on separating religious and political authorities as well as national and church identity. Number two. Number three, it defines the church state, and this is my language, as a platform builder and the church as a sign maker. Let me by platform builder, what I mean is it lays down the roads on which you drive. It builds the stage on which we live. That is to say, it's a limited protectionist jurisdiction that allows for people to live and get on with what God calls them to do. So Genesis 9 and the protective device of whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed, is given to government before Genesis 12 and the call to Abraham for a reason. An even more beautiful text in this is not in my notes, but 1 Timothy 2, where it tells us to pray for kings and emperors and all those in authority so that we might live peaceful and quiet lives. This is pleasing to God, who wants everyone to be saved. Now notice the two steps there. It's very interesting. Okay, so we're praying for the emperors and those in authority so that we can live peaceful and quiet lives. That's great. I want a peaceful, quiet, unmolested life. Godly and dignified in every way, it also says. I want a peaceful, quiet life where I'm allowed to live in what I understand to be a godly, dignified life. This is pleasing to God because, why? He wants all people to be saved. Does that mean it's Caesar's job to help all people to be saved? Well, no, that's the church's job. Caesar's job is just to protect us, keep us safe, so that we can live peaceful and quiet, godly lives, so that the church can do its work, which is to say the work of the state in a Baptist scheme is prerequisite work. Doesn't think you can get saved, but it provides the conditions in which people can get saved. It doesn't teach you to read the Bible, it teaches you to read. So the church can teach you to read the Bible. Make sense? It polices the streets so you can drive to church. Right? It protects the currency so you can give to the church. And on. We could go with different prerequisite to the work of the church work. The church then is a sign maker, according to Jesus in Matthew 16 and 18, declaring the what and the who of the gospel. Who do you say that I am? You're the Christ, the Son of the living God. That's right. Father in heaven told you that. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. The keys belong to the church, to the apostolic local church, to declare that's the right gospel, that's the right gospel confessor. Right? So the church, the state exercises the sword to provide the lane in which we can run. The church possesses the keys to declare who speaks for God, right? Number four, assigns the state a narrow, protectionist, non-utopian jurisdiction. Something that's good about liberalism, even in its Rawlsian form, is it has non-utopian, non-perfectionist ambitions for what the state can and can't do. And Baptists and American Presbyterians say, yeah, that's right. It doesn't provide perfection. Israel was to establish perfection, be holy because I'm holy, said the Lord. The church, picking up Israel's job, priestly job, too, is to point towards a perfectionist justice. Be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. The state has a much narrower lane, and language I commonly use is it has, you might say, a babysitter's jurisdiction as opposed to a parent's jurisdiction. What's the babysitter supposed to do? Get the kids fed, kept out of traffic, in bed on time. What is a parent supposed to do? Teach them to walk, teach them to read, teach them to eat, teach them to wipe themselves, teach them to worship, teach them to do math, teach them to marry. I mean, everything, right? The parent has a very broad jurisdiction. A babysitter has a very constrained, narrow jurisdiction. In the Bible, I would argue the state has more of a babysitter's constrained jurisdiction. Now, the babysitter in the Bible, government, should know it's under God. Mom and dad are coming home. Babysitter will be judged if babysitter doesn't listen to what God tells it to do. Nonetheless, under him, it has a very constrained jurisdiction. Number 5, affirms religious freedom. Number 6, encourages Christians to enter the public square as principled pragmatists with limited expectations. There's a sense in which a Baptist political theology, as I said, begins with the church, and in that sense almost has an Anabaptist view of the church. But it has more of a Reformed view of the goodness of the state, right? So Baptists very much encourage Christians to get, unlike the Anabaptist, encourage Christians to get involved in politics and kind of to be pragmatists. That is to say, use their wisdom to seek just laws. And they have a view of justice according to the Word of God. There it is in a nutshell. I could keep going. Yeah.
And anyone joining late by live stream, you need to rewind to see how this began,
It got
to
ugly.
know how we landed here
It got ugly.
as a piece of abstract art. Thanks, Jonathan and Paul. So I'm Matthew Arbo. I'm an Anglican. I am a moral and political theologian, but I was Baptist for several years, many years. And so Mark has asked me to offer just some informal comments, and then to set some terms for questions, which we want to spend plenty of time doing. So I want to thank both contributors, and also to say that it has been especially encouraging to see Baptists addressing theopolitical questions substantively for the last 10 to 20 years in particular. And I think Paul and Jonathan are share a considerable responsibility for just how widely Baptists are now read on these questions, and they deserve quite a bit of credit and recognition for that. I want mostly to identify some key Baptist distinctives that we can ask questions about and pose for wider discussion. And actually, they came up in the discussion today, looking back at some of the comments made. So one, let's ask some questions about the separation of church and state. It's a great way to input here, because that was a theme in both talks. Particularly the details of how that's worked out. Jonathan mentions, I think, about this being the ideal, where you have this compartmentalization or the separation that's operable. And the question is then, the natural practical question is, well, is it the case then that the judge and the representative and the police officer must then set aside this identity as a professing Christian in order to carry out their task? This is a big Protestant and Catholic question, even as early as the Renaissance and beyond. Early modern discussions about this. Exactly what sort of authority is conveyed or conferred in the taking of an office, right? And what part of one's Christian identity must one set aside in order to reach a certain verdict or judgment? So that's one thing. That's one side it can go. That is the Christian becoming holding a particular office. But it can come the other way as well. That is the invitation of the state to make certain provisions for the church. An example, not to say this is all Baptist churches, I don't want to paint wide swatches, is say churches' reception of COVID relief funds to support staffs, or something similar. You can think of other examples, there are plenty. Okay. These both might say, that was wrong, right? My wife would say the churches shouldn't have accepted those funds for her own reason. My wife's an attorney. But that's one, that can work both ways. So one way, the church's acceptance of assistance and support in material ways, or say the Christian carrying out an office. So that's one way that those practically work out. I think they both have responses, but I want those to be profitable points of discussion. The other is a different concept, but related. The concept of conscience. That's always been a slippery concept used by Baptists. I've seen it appear in slippery ways, but that's not just for Baptists, that's for all Protestantism, in my view. Conscience is often appealed to as a sort of guarantor of rectitude. If one is acting in conscience, they cannot be wrong. But of course, we know that can't be true. It's very possible for someone to act in conscience, full confidence. But it's often invoked as a way of guaranteeing one's space, or guaranteeing, or put it differently, reinforcing one's claim. So we want to talk about that too, I think, as a point of discussion. What does it mean to exercise one's conscience in the public square? Okay. What are the limits of that, if any? And particularly as that's related to the question about the church and state. And then the third question, I think this is a little bit more formally connected to Paul's talk about republicanism, which is well taken. And that is how that operates, if it can, put it differently, if that can operate independently of any substantive account of the virtues. All right. I think Paul has a response to that too. So if we're talking about republicanism as a central part of Baptist identity or central understanding of its political identity as a people, how is that operable, say, or durable apart from any substantive account of the virtues? Okay, so those three topics I think are good ones to take up in discussion, but we can also take them much further. I just want to identify them as coming up in the talks that were given, and we can then converse more. That's my part. Thanks. Okay, yes. So can we mark how much time we have for questions?
We have 28 minutes.
2.5 hours, 28 minutes, okay. 28 minutes. Okay, so I'll try to help facilitate, but if others see hands, please. Huh? Oh, yes.
Thank you for being here. My name is Earl Foote. And my question is, when you talk about Baptists, there isn't just one Baptist denomination. There are at least three that I know of: Southern, Independent, and American. So
Oh, there's hundreds.
over 100. Okay, that's so. What are your
We're a
thoughts? What are your thoughts for any one of the three about the different? I mean, obviously, Southern Baptists are quite different from American Baptists and so forth. So, is there a coherent theology throughout the Baptist spectrum?
Yeah, well, when you're referring to different denominations like that and the splits that have occurred between various Baptist groups, you're appealing to different, effectively, parachurch authorities. You're referring to different institutional structures. You're not actually getting at the question of the theology that undergirds all of them. And I think the theology that would undergird nearly all Baptists is a belief in regenerate church membership and believers' baptism. And you could say also in third place, moving into political theology, religious freedom. So whether you're American Baptist, Southern Baptist, National Baptist, Independent Baptist, if you're Baptistic, you might say, small b, you're going to affirm a believer's church, believer's baptism, and religious freedom. Yeah.
Good question. Additional questions, or if and there's laws, if you want to take up something that I've mentioned to discuss too.
In a thumbnail, how would you describe the major distinctives between, say, a Baptist political theology and a Wesleyan political theology? Both sort of low church traditions, never state churches, but different.
Honestly, I'm not sure I could. I don't feel like I have sufficient training to comment on Wesleyan. I mean, insofar as you're derived from Anglicanism, I do wonder if there would be forms of some sort of church-state establishment there, but you don't really see that in the Wesleyan tradition, right, that I can discern. Then the question becomes, okay, does concepts of its free will and perfectionism play in somehow to your church-state construct? I assume it must, but honestly, I've not really thought these things through. I'm sure you could give a better answer to your question.
Maybe I'll answer a similar question or a parallel question. The things that we've identified as distinctively Baptist are not exclusively Baptist. They are things that Baptists would tend to emphasize because of our prior theological commitments, because of the believer's baptism and the belief that the church membership is not going to overlap exactly with the national membership, the citizenry. That's going to lead us to disestablishment and things like that, and then the whole Republican edifice unfolds after that. And we're going to emphasize that more because of our strong theological anchor on believers' baptism. But other people believe in republicanism and religious freedom too. We just have the right reasons for it. I like to say the people who wrote the final draft of the First Amendment in the Constitutional, in the Congress in 1791, it was a Congregationalist, 2 Presbyterians, Episcopalian, I think a Unitarian, and even a Catholic. And they adopted the political theology of the Baptists, right? Everyone recognized the pragmatic utility of it. They could see the sort of the natural law reasons for it. We just had all the theology behind it.
See, Baptists would say, I say this in the chapter, Baptists would say, we didn't contribute much to the Protestant Reformation. We look to the Lutherans and thank them for their concepts of sola fide. We look to the Presbyterians and so forth and the good work they did on salvation and sovereignty and so forth. And we can look across the board and just see concepts of a right understanding of the Trinity and God going back through the whole great tradition. When it comes to the Protestant Reformation, all the Baptists did was come along and said, okay, in light of that view of sola fide, in light of the priesthood of all believers, we think that has certain implications for what the church is and what the state is. So our contribution to the Protestant Reformation, as we understand it, is a right view of the church and state, or a more constrained view, at least, of the state. Now, obviously, our magisterial friends would disagree with us. Nonetheless, let's be clear, we are inheritors of the greater, more crucial theological work of other Protestants, and we're just adding our little 2 cents on church and state. And in that sense, yeah, I think other traditions, in fact, can follow down that same track and do, as I pointed to the 1788 version of the Westminster Confession.
But note, you said this was an unstable mix. The thing that gives it stability and ballast, I think, is the right theology beneath it all.
Yeah.
Right. I think other people kind of can see, they can squint and say, oh, that looks kind of wise, but I don't know how stable it is and how do we get there? That's why the folks on the liberalism side and the highest good teleology side, when they're looking towards the center, they don't see something very sustainable. They don't trust it because they don't understand it. And I think that we can come along and say, no, this actually works, and here's how it all fits together.
It's unstable in this sense and not in this sense. It's unstable in the sense that you need God to produce a virtuous society, but you can't enforce God. That's it right there. That's what makes it hard. You need God for virtue, but you can't force people to believe in God. So that's what makes it unstable. What makes it stable, following on what Paul just said, is that actually I think that coheres with reality. I think creation design suggests there is a creator and there is a right or wrong. So that's going to pull you in this direction. At the same time, we can't enforce worship on him, which pulls us in that direction, which invariably leaves us somewhere in the middle. I mean, I can talk to your questions. I assume Paul could too, unless there's others.
Let me follow up. Jonathan, your third category up there, highest good teleology, which some would call authoritarianism. There are some online Baptists who seem to identify with it.
Some are moving in that direction.
But is Baptist political theology intrinsically at odds with that perspective?
Yes. They're betraying their Baptist roots, and sure enough, in short order, those doing that are jumping camps and ending up in Moscow or some other.
Clarify, you mean Moscow, Idaho, right?
Moscow, Idaho. When I say Moscow, Idaho for shorthand, raise your hand if you don't know what I mean.
Okay,
So this room understands. Yeah.
Kind of a couple of you. Well, they're not actually that far. Just the works of Doug Wilson. He refers to himself as a general equity theonomist, which is not as different from Reconstructionist theonomy as he would have you believe. He is calling for a much stronger version of the state. He would put the Apostles' Creed in the Constitution, for instance. And in a hypothetical world, though he downplays this, he and at least his disciples would be willing to prosecute blasphemy. So it's a much more vigorous form of the state.
Yeah, and look, it's not just online Baptist. There's a very large wing, a section of, I'd say American Christianity that is attracted to that. We talked about Catholic integralists, and there's Christian nationalists who are trending in that direction. And I would say that, yes, it's a betrayal of the Baptist political theology. It's also a misunderstanding of, when I talk about this stuff in front of audiences at Christian colleges and universities, I find a lot of young Christians simply don't understand why we have a First Amendment. They actually think the First Amendment is an obstacle to the kind of society we're supposed to build. because they have this kind of almost theocratic yearning, this impulse, like, oh, we need justice, we need righteousness in the public square, and so we need to take over and do it. And then they encounter the First Amendment and they think, this thing is inconvenient, I don't like it. And so what I want to remind everyone is that the First Amendment is actually Christian political theology, specifically Baptist, but I think all Christians should be able to recognize this is a principle of justice that was enshrined in the U.S. Constitution, and we should rejoice in it and protect it. I think Jesus wants us to keep the jurisdiction of the church and the jurisdiction of the state distinct and separate. It was a Baptist theologian who coined the phrase wall of separation. I know that gets a bad rap because, yes, some folks, I'd say on the secular left, have abused that to impose a state-sponsored secularism. That's not what I'm out for. I don't endorse that. But we do need to understand that Jesus wants us to have a church and have a state, and they are different things, and they should stay different.
And part of the inability of people to see that is most people having these conversations, most political philosophers, frankly have no ecclesiology. They've never studied the doctrine of the church. They don't know what the authority of the keys are. When I say the who and the what of the gospel, keys of the kingdom, bound and loose on earth, what's bound and loose in heaven, it's just like, Thomas Jefferson did not have an ecclesiology. John Rawls does not have an ecclesiology. Most Christians today do not have much of an ecclesiology. But if you don't know what the authority of the church is, if you don't know what it means to say, okay, the church has the authority to say that's the true gospel, that's a right understanding of God, and those are God's people. Well, if you don't get that, invariably you're going to ask the state to start defining a right understanding of God. But what if Jesus gave that authority to the church to define a right understanding of God? Well, that changes what the state is or is not authorized to do. And that's where once I was having coffee with your PhD supervisor, and one place I disagree with him, when he says, in his language, Charlemagne has the right to say right bishop, wrong bishop. Right? I'm just like, no, he doesn't. Charlemagne is not given authority from God to say right bishop, wrong bishop. He gave that to Peter, the apostles by extension to Matthew 16, and I would say to local churches in Matthew 18. They have the authority to say right gospel, right bishop, wrong bishop.
For the same reason, that is exactly why the Southern Baptist Convention in 1963 rejoiced when the Supreme Court struck down prayer in public schools. Same reasoning. You know the history here. For 100-some years, public school teachers would lead prayers and Bible studies in public schools because people say, as a Christian nation, we need to have prayer in public schools. The Supreme Court said you can't do that. That's a violation of church and state. And the Baptists at the time, rightly in my view, said, oh, Supreme Court, you got it right. We should keep public school teachers away from the teaching of God's word. That's not Caesar's job. Caesar makes a terrible Sunday school teacher. Keep Caesar's hands off of our Bible study. We need to keep that for the church's exclusive prerogative. And so today, those who would call for mandatory prayers in public schools, I think, are not understanding this ecclesiology.
We're doing kind of a tag team thing here, sorry. Springboarding off of that. Doug Wilson and others respond to that by saying, okay, but if you take God out of the public square, you're necessarily going to bring some other God in. It's not a question of authoritarianism or not. It's simply a question of whose authoritarianism, to which I actually agree. I think that's true. I think the laws that you seek to implement in the public square will necessarily have some theology or anti-theology behind them, right? Going to your question, must a judge set aside their Christian identities, uphold separation of church and state? It's impossible. It's impossible to set aside your religious identity when you step into the public square. Your view of justice comes from somewhere. It comes from your view of God. Big G, little g, whatever. That informs your view of justice, which in turn forms your view of public square. But what the theonomists like Wilson and others miss is this: limited jurisdiction. So everything I do in the public square, yes, it's beholden to some theology or anti-theology, but that doesn't mean I have an expansivist parent's jurisdiction. I still have a very constrained, if that's what God has given, constrained jurisdiction. Now, what's going on is some of our more authoritarian friends are saying, hey, look, woke identity politics is utterly totalitarian. That's true. I think in many respects, it does impose religion where religion shouldn't be imposed. But I would say Christianity, especially saying, let's constrain how far the government can actually go, even if their gods call for much more. Our God doesn't call for much more.
WWF referee intervenes here.
My question is specifically for Dr. Miller, but happy to hear other answers. It's interesting to hear that you think it was clearly the right decision in 1963 for public prayer to be, banned in public school. I'd love to know, though, how do you, I assume you would be in favor of the recent Supreme Court decision about the high school football coach in Bremerton, Washington, who had been praying at the 50-yard line at football games, and I think he was briefly fired, and then his job was reinstated after it was found that he was legally allowed to pray at the 50-yard line. And so I assume you think that was the correct decision. I guess I'm wondering, it seems like the decision in 1963 would negate the more recent Supreme Court case, but how does faith play out in a public school, for example? Why would the football coach be allowed to pray, whereas prayers in the classroom would not be allowed?
Yeah. So as I understand it, if I know the facts of the cases correctly, the 1963 case dealt with mandatory prayers, where the teacher would say, "Let us pray," and the students were essentially compelled to participate, and the public employee was in the role of leading a prayer, teaching God's word. That is theologically wrong and constitutionally wrong. The high school football coach, if I understand the facts right, was himself voluntarily going to the 50-yard line after a football game and praying, and people could come and join if they so pleased. That's a voluntary thing. It may get a little close to the line, but if it's voluntary and it's after hours, I'm comfortable with that. I'd be similarly comfortable in a public school if there was simply a moment of silence in which students could choose to bow their heads and pray by themselves if they wanted to. I'm comfortable with that. I know there's some people who are more strict separationists. I'm a bit more of an accommodationist, but I just want to make sure to maintain those lines. What would you think of this?
I'd say the same.
Yeah.
It's interesting. I think Rusty Reno used that same example of a time of ecumenical silence at the beginning of a classroom. And so it's interesting. Maybe it's not such a divergence actually between normal classical liberals like yourself and First Things editors.
Hello, my name is Andrew Ham. Work for the Fund for American Studies, and I'm a member at Capitol Baptist Church. Thank you, gentlemen, for your very insightful remarks. My question is this: why have Baptists been historically quiet, or at least perceived that way, on this subject of political theology, and why is there this resurgence in the last 10 to 20 years?
I think it's a fair critique from our Anglican and Presbyterian friends. All you guys got is religious freedom. You don't have much beyond that. You don't have theories of government and justice and so forth. I think in many ways that's because some of the tenets of the American founding functioned sufficiently to articulate what Baptists would want to say in those other areas, precisely as Paul was sort of insinuating along the way. And so where they felt like their contribution was to just kind of shore up that foundational plank of religious freedom, and some of these Republican instincts would sort of fill out the rest. I think and that works, to use the Washington Adams statement, in a virtuous society, but as a society becomes more and more unvirtuous, and as conceptions of liberalism, I think, became evacuated of any substantive content, more and more the proceduralist forms of liberalism that have become predominant since World War II especially started to yield decisions that aren't in keeping with righteousness, right? And as such, Baptists have found themselves scrambling to better articulate larger views of the state, to some extent, with or without the help of, John Locke or Thomas Jefferson.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. We do have a social theory. It is the republicanism. We didn't have to say it. Others were saying it for us. Also, groups that don't have power don't spend a lot of time theorizing how to use it. Right, so persecuted Christians, first 3 centuries under the Roman Empire, didn't have a lot of political theology because they were on the run, right? They weren't in charge of anything. They had no political power, so why develop a theology on how to use it? It's only after Constantine that you actually have Augustine, right? You have people thinking, oh, what do you do with power now? Similarly with the Baptists. They were largely persecuted by everyone else for centuries, and it was only relatively recently.
Matthew.
Yeah.
Anglicans.
Yeah, and so it's only recently that Baptists have been more mainstreamed. And look, Baptists were also of lower social and economic class and didn't have the education, and so didn't produce the thinkers to make the arguments. That's all changed in the last couple of generations. And so now there are Baptists who are in closer proximity to power, and there's more Baptist institutions and more Baptist thinkers, so we can make the arguments. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you all for your talk. Thinking historically, and given what you just said, maybe this is kind of just in the past few generations, but thinking historically, who are some of the key kind of contributors to a Baptist political theology? And secondly, where could one best procure the book that sparked this conversation? Thank you.
Well, historically, it's going to be the advocates of religious freedom. In some ways, people originally point to Roger Williams, a brief Baptist, but he articulated certain things. He used the language, not a wall of separation between church and state, but a garden.
Yeah.
Need a protected garden for the church relative to the state or something like that. A little bit later, you get John Leland and Isaac Backus in
Chapters 6 and 7.
Oh yeah, okay. who were friends, quote unquote, with James Madison and Thomas Jefferson, and did a lot to propound these ideas. Isaac Backus in particular, no, John Leland in particular was friends with James Madison and demanded certain compromises, including a Bill of Rights and freedom of establishment, from establishment, and managed to get it from Madison. There'd be a few others, but those would be some of the bigger names.
Yeah, and that is partly what this book was for. It was to recover some of that history and make it more widely accessible. So we have a chapter on Roger Williams, a chapter on Leland, a chapter on Bacchus, and then in the 20th century, a chapter on Carl Henry.
Right.
And in the present day, Jonathan Leeman and his book, Political Church, and his book, How the Nations Rage, are 2 texts I'd point you to as excellent examples of modern day Baptist political theology. And I'll also call out one of my co-editors, Andrew Walker. He's written one book on religious freedom. I think it's called Freedom for All. And then last week published a book on natural law called Faithful Reason, which is a really good complement to these conversations. So there's a handful of names for you. You can find this on Amazon. Yeah.
Hi there, my name's Daniel. Jonathan, you talked a lot about how republicanism is an unstable compound. And I think it's a really helpful analogy for what we're seeing today, living in the structures and systems that we've inherited from past times, superimposed upon new cultural realities. And I guess I've heard magisterial Protestants kind of in the Twitter realm talk about, sort of make similar points to you that, republicanism works if you have a virtuous society. John Adams, famously said that our Constitution was made for religious, moral people, and it's inadequate to govern any other kind of people. So I guess the disagreement is over when we reach that point where this is no longer salvageable. And maybe to put it negatively, is republicanism a luxury good? Is this like the ideal form of government when you have an ideal polity, but we've downgraded? And that's obviously the point that the magisterials are making, but why do you disagree with them over whether we've reached that point?
Yeah, it's not simply a judgment call about the historical moment and whether or not picking up the sword is necessary to enforce various kinds of virtue. I'm going to go back once more time to this idea of limited jurisdiction, which is to say, I do not understand God has authorized government to enforce the First table of the law, commandments 1 through 4, have no other gods, no idols, don't take my name in vain, Sabbath. Nowhere in Scripture do I see has God given governments of the nations. Take out Israel for a second. We can deal with Israel, but the nations, Pharaoh, Nebuchadnezzar, Cyrus, Pilate, Joe Biden. Nowhere does he authorize them to say, yes, you can pick up the sword to enforce the first table of the law. Rather, he gives it authority, broadly speaking, take out the 10th commandment, kind of the second table of law. Not love of God stuff, love of neighbor stuff, you might say. So I would say in response, I'd go back to Genesis 9, where it says, whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed. Just think about that phrase for a second. What's the trigger for governmental action? Shedding of blood of man. And as one theologian puts it, what about sinning against God? Can you shed God's blood? What about blasphemy? There's no trigger for action there. The trigger for governmental action in that kind of isolated sense is harm against human, not harm against God as such. And again, if we keep reading through the Bible, other than the life of Israel, whose authority goes to the church, other than Israel, there is no authorization to enforce the first table of the law. So I would just say my difference with magisterial Protestantism isn't merely that they think the moment's worse than I think it is. It's that I don't think you actually have the authority from Jesus to pick up the sword and do that. Like, that's usurpation, right? So that's where it would come down to a theoretical principle difference and not just a prudential judgment difference.
I have two answers. Have we lost our virtue? Can we keep a republic? There's this narrative that Christians have that once upon a time we were a moral, virtuous people, but there's been a decline and fall, and now we're pagan and evil, as if we were good in the 1790s. But in the 1790s, we were also slaveholders and racists and engaged in widespread, Indian removal. We weren't that good back then. We didn't actually have that much virtue. During the century when we had prayer in public schools, that was the century of Jim Crow. So it didn't do a whole lot of good in sustaining our virtue. So I'm not convinced by this narrative that there's been this moral decline and fall, that we used to be good and now we're not. If anything, we never were good. We're just bad in a different way in different domains of life now. But I'm also not convinced...
You'd say the public square is more opposed to Christianity, wouldn't you?
There's where I'm going. I'm not convinced we're quite that bad. I think there's another tendency in Christian circles of nut picking, of finding an extreme example of something really bad and then treating that as if it's representative of everything going on in the world. So the campus protesters, right? The pro-Hamas, pro-terrorist sympathizers out there. Yeah, there's a handful of them. It's a small minority. That is not characteristic of all college kids today. Or the other examples of degeneracy you might find. It's just not a paradigmatic example of everything going on. I work in a more secular space. I'm a minority where I am. And so I have more daily interaction with people who are very different than I am. And they believe in democracy. Believe it or not, they actually do. And I'm not afraid for a future in which they hold political power. I'm not going to agree with everything they do, but I don't think they're about to bring down the republic. Yes, I do agree that I think our public square can be more hostile, more scornful of traditional Christianity. So it can be more uncomfortable in public spaces. Man up. It has always been thus. It's a luxury to be comfortable in your Christianity. That was a luxury we had for a century or so, and it's over because most of the people who were pretending to be Christians just aren't pretending anymore. So I'm not that convinced that we're much smaller a minority than we used to be. It's just our culture has changed its pretense, that's all. And so get used to it. Jesus promised persecution.
His pretense and his pronouns.
Yeah. So curious about, have you mentioned the Baptistic theology focused on actually encouraging have political involvement? And I was thinking about, the Baptistic idea of the independent local church tends to be a very powerful force in people's lives. And I think I've met a lot of people where practically they end up kind of feeling that their obligations to the local church, they're kind of scheduling around the church, they're moral centering around kind of the do one another to commands of Scripture, again, around the local church, those things can very easily add up to just precluding sort of political activity involvement in people's lives. So I was curious how you think about Baptistic political theology encouraging both that kind of focus on the independent local church and active political involvement.
Thank you for asking that. It's a part of my talk I skipped over for time's sake. But yeah, I wrote a book called Political Church in which I argued that the New Covenant emphasis that's characteristic of Baptists looks at the Old Testament and says, it seems that having God's people in God's place with God's law and even God's presence is no guarantor of righteousness. They became just like the nations and had to be removed. The only way to guarantee true righteousness and justice is, in fact, the Holy Spirit, God Himself coming in His Spirit and in His Son and recreating born-again hearts. Then you get righteousness and justice, right? So who's the city on the hill? It's not, sorry, Thomas Winthrop, Massachusetts Bay Colony, sorry John Kennedy, sorry Reagan, sorry Obama. It's not the nation, it's not America, it's the church. That's the city on the hill, right? Which is to say we should expect to see justice and righteousness played out first and foremost in the local church, at least if we're doing what we should be doing, right? It's there we should be loving our enemies. It's there we should be beating our swords into plowshares and our spears into pruning hooks. It's there, to quote Lincoln, we should achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace with ourselves and with all nations, going to all nations. All of these things should be happening in the church, which is to say churches should care more about being a transformed society than transforming society, care more about being a redeemed nation than trying to redeem the nation. And once we take care of our own house, once we take care of our own business, hopefully that then spills outward to doing justice and righteousness in our political engagement. You don't want a parent on the lecturing circuit talking about being a good parent whose kids are neglected at home, right? In the same way, I think Christians need to do a better job of caring within their local churches and letting that be the lesson, the guide to how we then go out and engage the public square.
A final word from each of you, maybe 3 or 4 sentences in terms of our current political and religious moment in America. What does Baptist political theology offer as a sort of metaphorical balm of Gilead?
Ditto what he said. I'll just repeat my thanks to Mark and to IRD. Thank you, Matt, as well. It was remarkable to me that we didn't coordinate our talks, but I think landed in a pretty similar spot. And I think that's a testament to the consistency and the resilience of the Baptist political theology, centered on ideas of republicanism, religious freedom, disestablishment. And I would just plead for Christians of all denominations to recognize the fragility and the value of this precarious balance that was bequeathed to us, and we should be cautious before we throw it away. And one of the easiest ways to throw it away is to declare that it's already dead, right? Going around saying the Constitution is dead is a great way to kill the Constitution. So simply being out in public, affirming the value of the Constitution and saying, let's keep it, that itself is a good public witness. And I think that's a good act of justice that Christians should try to do, is to support a framework of equality under law that we already have, so please let's keep it.
In moments of cultural and political dissension, division, tumult, the temptation is always to reach for a strong man, right? When things seem chaotic, you go for a strong man. That can be the ideological strongman that the left offers. That can be an actual populist personality on the right. But in both cases, when people feel instability and division and the world seems to be getting bad, they're going to reach for a theological or actual strongman. And I think what Baptist political theology offers is hold on, you're not going to get what you think you're going to get there. That it in fact is going to yield greater injustices down the road if you give yourself over to that populist or ideological strongman. So it should temper our expectations. Non-utopian expectations are what I think a Baptist political theology helps to engender, even as it points people to the church and the promise of Christ's victory.
Expect less of the state.
Yeah.
Thank you. If you happen to have come and you're not Baptist, my guess is you probably found yourself in considerable agreement with a lot of things that were said by these two guys.
You could say something skeptical.
I could do. I'm just too conciliar at the moment. That's it. And I think under conditions, the social and political conditions being what they are, finding those substantive points of concord are that much more important. And to recognize authoritarian impulses for what they are, that all authoritarian impulses are paradoxical. They reach for the strongman, but they're actually inherently hopeless because they don't believe that God is still active in history.
Yeah.
And that's a common form. Like me as an Anglican affirm that wholeheartedly as a Baptist. And that's a key political assumption because once that's jettisoned, then you do reach around snatching for any possible cure to the malady, even something like a strongman. That's the solution to our state is solved, right? Christ stands victorious over sin and death.
Amen.
Thank you, Jonathan Leeman. Thank you, Matthew Arbeau. Thank you, Paul Miller. And thank you to all of you who are here with us physically this evening. And those of you who are watching online, all of you need to immediately go to Amazon and order a copy of Baptist Political Theology. It'll change your life. And it's been a great conversation.
Good plug.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks to you.